Thanks for taking part in this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. In this brief Bible dive, we're talking about the history of the Second Jewish Temple. This is the one that was rebuilt years before Nehemiah led the charge to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It's the temple in which Jesus himself worshipped maybe about a half a millennia later. So here's the background on this temple. The Jewish people had this tabernacle or tent as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and then for years after that. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Years later, after a Jewish kingdom was established in the Promised Land, King David moved the people's capital to Jerusalem, and then his son, King Solomon, built the first temple. The Ark of the Covenant was moved to the temple and placed right in the center, in the place called the Holy of Holies, the central, most sacred place of the temple. The Jewish kingdom then eventually split in two, and you had the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, and Jerusalem remained the capital of Judah. In 732 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and then in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And then they destroyed Jerusalem, its walls, the first temple, and then sent the leading citizens in exile to Babylon. Now we know that some of the sacred objects in the temple were saved during this captivity, because the book of Daniel recounts in Daniel chapter 5 that the Babylonian king, Belshazzar, actually used them in one of his many orgy-like feasts in his temple. And essentially that one act there, God's patience was run out. That one act, it ticked God off so much that God inspired the Persians to conquer the Babylonians right after that incident. And then Belshazzar, the king, was killed in a, well, let's just say, rather dishonorable way. And there was, however, no mention of the Ark of the Covenant with those sacred objects. In fact, the Ark disappears from biblical history after the destruction of that first temple. There's speculation that remains as to whatever happened to the Ark. It was holding inside the original 10 Commandments, a container of manna from the wilderness. It had Aaron's staff. After the Persians conquered the Babylonians, they allowed the Jewish people to begin to return to their homeland. And we have heard through accounts that they actually brought many of those sacred objects back to the temple. See, the Persians, by and large, were a much more tolerant people of other people's faith. They were also pretty shrewd leaders because they knew that allowing people to return to their homelands and rebuild those places would actually endear the Persians to those many diverse tribes within their empire. That's actually why the Roman Empire understandably had a deep mistrust for the Jewish people centuries later. Among other things, the fact that the Jewish people worshipped one God and not many, like the Romans, rightly so, suspected that the Jewish people, if given the choice, would side with the Persian Empire over the Roman Empire, because the Persians had treated them so much better. So when the exiles were allowed to return back to Jerusalem, this is going back again to Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on, or as the Persians called it, the Yehud province, they got to work rebuilding the temple. According to Ezra chapter 2, this initial group of people returning, they amounted to 42,360 of the citizens or the people, with an additional 7,337 servants, and it says 200 singers. The fact that these people returning after around 70 years in exile had this many servants actually tells us the people did fairly well for themselves in Babylon despite the trauma of exile. At that point, at the beginning there, Zerubbabel was the governor who oversaw the construction of the second temple. And prophets like Haggai and Zechariah were strong advocates for this work. You can go back and read Haggai and Zechariah, the Old Testament books, and hear more about it. Well, the people first rebuilt the altar, and they placed it right on the spot where the original altar in the first temple stood, where the Holy of Holies would be. And then they got to work clearing away the debris from the destruction of the first temple. And then they eventually built the rest of the second temple. So Nehemiah, when he became governor, he then instituted strict adherence to the Mosaic law, the law that God gave to the people through Moses. And the Persians allowed the Jewish people to worship freely under their own rules. But it was, certainly with the caveat that they would recognize and pay homage to the power of that Persian Empire. This tolerance of the Jewish people was really a blessing for them. And it lasted until about Alexander the Great came charging through the area, including defeating the Persians in 332 BC. The Seleucids, who were descendants of one of Alexander's three great generals when Alexander's Macedonian Empire was divided between his three generals after his death, these Seleucids took control and then began to oppress the Jewish people. And really one of the worst of these oppressions included what has been called the Abomination Desolation, when the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes had a pig slaughtered on the altar in the Holy of Holies. And of course, a pig is as unkosher as one could get, and he did it on purpose for that reason. Well, in response to all this stuff, this oppression, the Maccabean family led a successful revolt and reestablished a Jewish kingdom, recaptured the temple for the Jewish people, the Second Temple. This successful revolt included the events of the oil not going out, which led to the holiday that we call Chanukah. The kingdom they ruled was called the Hasmonean dynasty, and it lasted until it was invaded by King Herod, also known as Herod the Great, who conspired with the Romans to take over the area and be declared king. And, he would pay homage to the Romans, but they would also let him be a king of this place. And Herod was an unquenchable builder. And so Herod decided to expand the Jewish Second Temple. So while major work was finished before his death, in 6 BC, the whole part of his project wasn't completed until 63 AD, just 7 years before that Second Temple's destruction by the Romans. It took that long to complete all of the work that he wanted to do. Still, by the time that Jesus visited the temple right before his own death, enough of the expansion was done that, believe it or not, this Second Temple was the largest building in the entire world at that time. This is the building that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, first experienced as a young child. Then years later as a rabbi when he came for worship, when he drove the money changers from the area with a whip, actually it says in the Bible, because they had turned the house of God into a marketplace or a den of thieves, and right nearby of which he was arrested and tried and crucified. Finally, in 70 AD, the people revolted against the Roman overlords, and the Romans came in and utterly destroyed the opposition, including burning the Second Temple to the ground. The Roman general in charge of suppressing the Jewish revolt was, in a strange twist of irony, was the one who archaeologists say maybe then became an emperor, and then archaeologists and historians now say would have taken the gold melted down from the destruction of that Second Temple and then used it when being Roman emperor to build the Colosseum in Rome. So happened to be the Roman general, but then became an emperor, used the gold from the temple in being burnt down to build this Colosseum that certainly has a lot of impact in the life of Christians. And so it was here that the young Christians would have been slaughtered, would have been sacrificed, in these gladiatorial games by those, and they would have been killed in faith because they believed in Jesus Christ. And now, 2,000 years later, what do we have left? What do we have left from this whole thing? Well, people will still go to what we call the Wailing Wall, that last remnant of the Second Temple, the place where people gathered to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there is still a remnant of the wall of the temple left, or at least of the foundations of it. But that's the history of the Second Temple. Started with the time right before Nehemiah, went up through Jesus's time, but still in a way has an impact to this day. So thanks again for joining with me, Pastor Nick, and beautiful Savior in Bloomfield Hills for this brief Bible dive. To learn more about our church, we invite you to our website, bslcmi.org. And of course, we'd love for you to subscribe to the YouTube channel that we have and click that bell to receive notifications for when more of our videos go up. Now go out and love God and love your neighbors.